Well, welcome everyone. My name's Henry Butler. I'm the Henry G. Manny Professor of Law and Economics at the law school, a former dean of the law school, and I am currently chair of the Law and Economics Center, which has me in the great position of being able to enjoy all the great work that Donald Cochin has been doing as executive director of the Law and Economics Center. And really, it's the reason I wanted to come up here and start this off is out of embarrassment. I'm a native Virginian who prides myself on knowing a lot about the history of the state and a lot about the history of the Commonwealth, and to keep track of a lot of these things. And I was totally stunned when we came up on the 300th birthday of George Mason. I was kind of mad at him. You know, I should have known that. And because of that, I wanted to give Donald all the credit for making this great event come together. Please give a warm welcome to Donald Cochin.
Well, thank you, Henry. And certainly I do not deserve all the credit. I'll tell you some of the people who do in just a moment. But good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's a delight to have all of you here and a delight to be here to celebrate the unforgotten founder, a celebration of George Mason's legacy on the occasion of his 300th birthday. As Henry mentioned, I'm Donald Cochin. I'm the executive director of the Law and Economics Center here at Scalia Law School and also professor on the faculty. And it is a delight to bring all of you together for this program. I want to thank Henry. I want to thank Secretary Scalia for being with us tonight, the many state and federal judges who've joined us as well, members of the faculty and the students of George Mason and the law school across a variety of university departments, government officials, and members of the community from not only this state in Northern Virginia, but from around the country. Thank you for joining us as part of this program. I want to give special thanks also to our co-sponsors tonight. Gunston Hall, as you see here and as you saw, brought us a wonderful exhibit outside. If you did not see it before this event, I hope you will visit it on your way out, as well as the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, who also provided some of the materials and exhibits that you were able to enjoy during the reception. Your seats do not have keys below them to a new car, but they do have on them what I believe to be the only pocket copy of the Virginia Declaration of Rights.
All right.
So I hope you will take that with you and know that this is a very special celebration in which we are not only celebrating the George Mason and his legacy on his 300th birthday, but we'll also be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Rights in just a short time. An enormous amount of gratitude and the real credit for the success of this program goes to the LEC staff who've helped put this all together. And I will mention those who have been most critical in executing this program, and please, we'll give them applause at the end. Allison Price is our Director of Operations. Gwendolyn Watson is our Program Coordinator for our Manny Division, or our Academic Division, and was responsible for organizing much of this content tonight. Olivia Corso is our Program Assistant. Amanda Osofsky, who is our Program Manager, who helped put together a variety of the materials that you see before you. Heather Vignali and Abby Plummer are our events staff. We do thank all of them for making this night a well-coordinated event. So please give them a round of applause. I'd like to also thank the catering staff from RSVP, as well as the U.S. Marshals and the Arlington and campus security who've helped keep us safe tonight. And of course, thank you to the panelists for coming here to share your thoughts and your insights on the statesman and his legacy for our consideration tonight. There's an awful lot happening at George Mason, including this wonderful, beautiful new building, and I'm glad that we have an opportunity to highlight it for this particular event. We often talk about things in by the numbers here at Scalia Law School, and I'll use that method to give you just a little bit of a snapshot of what's occurring here, to give you a sense of what's happening not only at the law school, but at the Law and Economics Center over the recent days. Scalia Law School, for those of you who have not yet known, is presently number 31 in the U.S. News and World Report. We're number 12 in public law schools across the nation. Our faculty regularly ranks in the top 30 in terms of scholarly impact, as well as currently being ranked #1 in downloads per author on the Social Science Research Network. Our students are fantastic. 159 students joined us this year with a 169 median LSAT and a 3.93 median GPA, some of the highest numbers in the country and the highest that we've had in our history. 102 students are set to clerk for state or federal judges in the 2025 to 2028 term. So very excited about the successes of our students. That's just a few things happening there. A few things happening at the Law and Economics Center. We're celebrating our 51st year. This is our 51st anniversary. Last year alone, the LEC educated at multi-day in-person programs 854 state and federal judges, 1,344 academics, and more than 100 attorneys from state attorneys general's offices. It's a very robust offering that we have here. As part of the initiative started in 2022 that I think George Mason would be very proud of, our state Supreme Court Justices Initiative. We have since 2022 had 227 state Supreme Court justices participate in our programs. Of those, 94 were unique, and it was across 34 states. Continuing on by the numbers, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary, as I said, of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. We are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence as well, both in 2026. And we are celebrating what is near and dear to the LEC's heart, the 250th anniversary of the first publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith in 2026 as well. But most important, for tonight's purposes, we celebrate the 300th birthday of George Mason, the statesman. To get us started, it's my honor to introduce Nell Payne, who's going to give a few opening remarks. Ms. Payne received her JD from George Washington University in 1982. She had a 35-year career across private practice, as well as in Congress, the executive branch as well. She retired in 2016 after 16 years as the Director of Governmental Relations at the Smithsonian Institution. And tonight, she'll offer insight based on that background, as well as her heritage as a 9th-generation descendant of George Mason IV. So with that, I turn it over to Nell Payne.
Good evening. Thank you, Donald, for that introduction. American democracy was an experiment. It was the first time a group of people decided to form a government based not on geography or ethnicity, but on a shared commitment to principles. The framers understood that the structure of their new government must guard the rights of citizens against the potential tyranny of government. Perhaps none of them was as finely attuned to the frailties of human nature and the corrupting influence of accumulated power as George Mason. And he was respected and consulted by his colleagues. George Washington sought his advice on how to respond to the Townsend Acts and said that there was no person better qualified to solve a problem regarding an issue of the financing of the Revolutionary War. James Madison referred to him as a powerful reasoner, a profound statesman, and a devoted Republican. Thomas Jefferson called him the wisest man of his generation and of the first order of greatness. George Mason's contributions to American democracy are numerous, if not all that well known. He was the chief architect of, among many other foundational documents, the Fairfax Resolves, and of 2 documents whose words still ring today as adapted in our Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the Virginia Constitution. It is fitting that a bas-relief of Mason is one of only 23 in the chamber of the U.S. House of Representatives that honor the great lawmakers of history. Though the Constitutional Convention of 1789 did not include his proposed protections for individual liberties, and he vigorously opposed it primarily for that reason, I have always been comforted by the fact that Mason lived to see the ratification of the Bill of Rights 10 months before he died in October 1792. One of his last visitors at Gunston Hall was Thomas Jefferson, a week before his death. Thank you for recognizing George Mason with this evening's event, in the year of the 300th anniversary of his birth.
Thank you, Nell. And now for the main event. And for that, I turn to our moderator to take it from here, Judge Michelle Childs. Judge Childs has an established career in law, starting in private practice, moving into state government in South Carolina, elected by the South Carolina General Assembly to serve as a circuit judge in 2006. She was appointed to the district court for the District of South Carolina in 2010 by President Obama. She was appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit in 2022 by President Biden. And since 2017, she has served as an advisory board member for the Law and Economics Center at Scalia Law School. And for that, I thank you for your sage counsel and guidance over the years. And with that, I turn it over to Judge Childs, who will take the floor to discuss the panelists and their backgrounds and move us through to the main event. Thank you.
All right. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the George Mason family and everyone associated with the Law and Economics Center at George Mason University, Antonin Law School. Fellow judges and attorneys, and of course our distinguished guests and followers of liberty. So 300 years ago, on December 11, 1725, a child was born in Virginia who would become the conscience of the American founding and change the course of human freedom. And through commanding armies, holding the highest offices, but through the power of his pen and the clarity of his convictions. George Mason authored the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776, which was a precursor to the American Bill of Rights that shaped our Constitution and inspired declarations of human rights around the world. Tonight, we gather to celebrate George Mason, whom many perceive as a forgotten founder. Yet his words continue to echo across centuries and continents. Consider the profound simplicity of his opening words, that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights. These words were not merely elegant prose or aspirational phrases. During Mr. Mason's time, they were revolutionary assertions of fundamental rights that challenged the entire edifice of monarchical power, hereditary privilege, and governmental absolution. He was a man of principle who refused to sign the final draft of our Constitution because it lacked a Bill of Rights to guard individual liberties against government overreach. His refusal was not obstruction, it was prophecy, and it helped secure the fundamental freedoms that we enjoy today. We call him unforgotten because his legacy lives wherever liberty is cherished, wherever rights are defended, and wherever constitutions are debated. So we honor him tonight with a renewed commitment to the principles he championed. I'm very delighted to moderate the panel with these esteemed jurists and professors. We have the Honorable Edith Hollan Jones of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, the Honorable William C. Mims, Senior Justice, Supreme Court of Virginia, Akhil Reed Amar, on my far left, Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science, Yale Law School, and Michael S. Greve, Professor of Law, right here at Antonin Scalia School of Law. So welcome, panelists, as well, and thank you, audience, for having us. So let's start the discussion. Why is George Mason often claimed to have been forgotten? Is it really just because he refused to sign the Constitution? And I'll start out with any panelist on that one.
Well, that wasn't what I was expecting you to start by saying. But anyway, of course, I'm a Texan. And when we think of Texas, we think of the heroes of the Alamo. So I'm often pleased to learn that there were some other heroes of freedom before the Alamo. And now that I've learned a great deal about George Mason, I have incredible respect for him. I think he is unjustly not more forgotten than he should have been, I suppose. As was said at the beginning, the other framers revered his knowledge, his capability, his insights, and his prudence. So to start off the discussion, I have a few minutes to talk about the background of this man, this extraordinary man. He was born a fourth-generation American, if you can imagine that, in 1725. He was left fatherless at the age of 10 when his father, who ran the plantation, was in a boat crossing the Potomac River that capsized, and everyone was lost. At that point, he became reared by his mother and his uncle, who had been a lawyer in England and had a very substantial library of the classics and of legal treatises. Well, obviously, the young Mason was studious and read all of the materials that were available for him. In fact, later on, people thought he was a lawyer. He had written a compilation of the land law of Virginia and the other historical sources of law, such that they often mistook him for a lawyer. He, not only that though, he was ran a plantation. And the plantation itself was 5,500 acres. He had about 200 slaves. At one point, his family owned what the land that amounts today to about 4/5 of Fairfax County, thousands and thousands of acres, much of which was cultivated by tenant farmers. So he was quite the businessman. Others will dwell on the slavery angle. But the point is that unlike many of the plantation owners, he managed his own business. He kept his own books. He rode around the plantation every day. He studied agriculture and agronomy in order to wean himself as he could off of tobacco as the cash crop that depleted the soil so badly. He ran in the plantation, of course, like Mount Vernon. It was a small community, basically self-sustaining, and he knew how to run every bit of it, along with his beloved wife. I personally think that his involvement in commercial transactions was an important component that brought him down from the high plateaus of classical philosophy and natural rights and so on to the practicalities of governance. He was a family man, unlike so many people in these years. 9 of his children lived to adulthood. That was an extraordinary number of children. He loved his children dearly. Many of the papers are his correspondence with his children that reflect his love, his concern. The great advice he gave to one of them was that you have to be diligent, frugal, and prudent, and without these, all the best prospects will fail. I'd like that for my children and grandchildren. However, at his age, about 38 years old, his wife, whom he loved very much, after bearing twins who passed away, died as a consequence of illness related to that childbirth, leaving his children without a mother when the youngest was only 2 or 3 years old, and they ranged up to about 18 at the time. So that was one reason, I am sure, that Mason was not fond of leaving the plantation. He was a public servant, but he was not a public man. He also speculated in the development of the West through a company called the Ohio Company, which he managed the finances of for decades. Didn't come to much, but he did learn a lot about and was a big advocate for the westward expansion of the American people. You will become familiar with the fact that he was one of the first advocates of the religion clause, and he put a religion clause into the Virginia Declaration of Rights, but something that I think may be underestimated in what I've read about Mason is he was a serious, in my view, churchman, an Episcopalian. He was a vestryman at his church for 25 or 30 years, had a seminal role in the church. He engaged in morning prayer every day, grace before meals, ensured that his children said their prayers every night, and a lot of his focus on the need for moral virtues and uprightness, in my view, comes from his adherence to the Christian religion. But as I say, he and James Madison were of one accord on the importance of tolerating all views. And in fact, he was a big advocate of bringing in Germans who were undoubtedly Lutherans to settle those Western lands. Last thing I want to point out is that he evolved he had no reason to be against king and country. As late as 1765, he came to public attention when he wrote a letter of reproof of London merchants who were trying to persuade the Americans to go along with the Stamp Act. And it started off with a sardonic comparison of the patriarchal way in which the people over in England would speak about their young children in the colonies. In that regard, he, at the end of that, which was a strong defense of no taxation without representation, the jury trial and other things, he says, but nevertheless, we are loyal servants of the king. That was 1765. But as the British government continued to turn the screws on the colonies, financially and otherwise, he became one of the most stalwart defenders of independence. And in fact, this is another important point. He was really a quartermaster for the Virginia militia that participated in the revolution. So he had to get the gunpowder and the weapons and the foodstuffs that enabled them to keep fighting.
Thank you. Turn over to
All right.
Ms. Mance.
Yeah, you know, I think the reason why he is somewhat forgotten is that he didn't care to be remembered in the same way as some of the others. George Mason was a contemplative. We would call him an introvert in the 21st century. Spent a lot of time on his farm by himself, particularly after his wife Anne died. He poured his interest and his time into his 9 children. One other founder who was somewhat contemplative, but who was certainly not self-effacing, was Thomas Jefferson. Let's look at Thomas Jefferson and George Mason's interactions, okay? So, I want you to imagine that you are a high school government teacher, okay? You're going to assign your students the following prompt. What are the principles of natural rights? George, your best student, writes, all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. That gets an A. Then you read Tommy's paper. Tommy is a dreamer, often looking out the window to the distant mountains. Listen carefully. He writes, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal and independent, and that from that equal creation they derive rights inherent and inalienable, among which are the preservation of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness." You might suspect Tommy of plagiarism. So I just read Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence. It's not plagiarism, but a very close adaptation. So close that historian Joseph Ellis described Jefferson as Mason's editor-in-chief, smoothing the rough edges and condensing his prose. Now, Mason, I don't think really cared who got the credit. Jefferson did. He's affiliated with another university a little bit further to the south. One could conclude that Jefferson began with Mason's declaration right in front of him and revised it. And in fact, that's what the historical record shows. Mason began to draft his Declaration of Rights in Williamsburg in mid-May 1776. We know that Francis Lightfoot Lee brought an early draft to Philadelphia in late May and gave it to Thomas Jefferson. Mason's final draft was published in a Philadelphia newspaper on June 6th. Jefferson began to draft the Declaration of Independence on June 11th. Jefferson did acknowledge Mason's greatness, as has been pointed out. He described him as the Cato of his country, a man of the first order, earnest for Republican change on democratic principles. So I just think that George Mason was comfortable with who he was. His legacy was not his words, his legacy was his children. He was perhaps the greatest intellectual, certainly the greatest intellectual of that generation, remembering that James Madison is 26 years younger. And in fact, I think Mason was somewhat of an intellectual mentor for Madison. Mason finally died at not a particularly propitious time. It was 1792. The Bill of Rights had just been ratified 10 months earlier. The Federalists were on the ascendancy. If he had died in 1799, as did George Washington, after the failed Adams administration, after the Alien and Sedition Act, I think perhaps his legacy would have risen at the time. I think George Mason's tombstone could have said, "I told you so."
Nicely done.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. He died relatively early, right? So it's 1792. And that entails, I mean, for one thing, he didn't have time to sort of build a record in any administration, right? Either Washington's or for that matter, Adams, unlike somebody who's, equally sort of, sort of forgotten. But we remember him as first Attorney General, right? Edmund Randolph. That's memorable. And it had the other effect, I think, of he's not easily claimable by one political camp or intellectual tradition or another, right? So it's very, very hard to sort of dress him up as a Southern agrarian and states' rights guy. He wasn't, right? And the politics at the time of the Philadelphia Convention, the ratifying convention, was much more fluid than our sort of image of the Federalists on one side, and that's Hamilton, right? And the Anti-Federalists on the other, and they didn't sign the Constitution. That's much too easy, right? It was very fluid, and he had a very ambivalent and ambiguous position in all of that. And so nobody really sort of picked up on or claimed George Mason as their own, right? And you see this in things little and small. I mean, just to mention the biggest thing, yeah, he was completely over the top at the Virginia ratifying convention. And Madison got very, very impatient with him. But if you watch him at the Constitutional Convention, he was one of the most eloquent spokesmen for the Constitution. He got this down, right? He discovered he articulated the sort of Archimedean point of the Constitution. It's a government over individuals and not over states. You get that? He articulated that much earlier, much clearer, much more clearly than even Madison himself. Made a lot of contributions on the Committee of Detail and other committees, the language, high crimes and misdemeanors, that's his language, right? So it's very hard against that backdrop to dress him up as sort of an anti-federalist to his death. So the politics at the time were just much more fluid, and so, and you know, his positions were evolving and kind of complicated, and no matter how big your reputation is at the time of your life, if nobody can sort of point to you and say, that's us, and that's our forefather, you tend to be forgotten. And mind you, I mean, the forgetfulness is not sort of just a modern day thing. Oh, he owned slaves and he didn't sign the Constitution and that settles that, right? It set in very, very quickly after his death in 1792. I think the first statue of George Mason was actually erected in 1996 on the Fairfax campus.
All right, Professor.
So I think complicated is a good word. Let me talk about maybe 5 time slices. The first one is from 1776. You've heard it alluded to. His draft of the Virginia Declaration of Rights is different than the final version. And so I want you to hear the first version and then the final version. His version is that all men are born equally, as in birthright, are born equally free and independent, and have certain inherent natural rights which they cannot by any compacts deprive or divest their posterity. Okay, that's his version. If you listen to that, if we're all born equally free and independent, how can some people be born slaves and some people be born masters? And other people in Virginia pay attention to this. They change the language. So here's the final language of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, that all men are by nature, and that can mean a couple of different things. It can mean born, from the French naître, and naturalis, natura in Latin, to be born. But it can also mean just natural rights more abstractly, that all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. So the Virginia, the final version, is weaselly because it says, oh, you only have these rights when you enter society, and white masters have never been in a state of society with black slaves. So it's different. Now, on who, cribbed from whom, Tommy and George, this is all just straight John Locke, word for word, and I'll go in there and pull out my book and actually read you John Locke. So it's not George, truthfully, and it's not Tom, it's actually John. So there you have it. And there's nothing wrong with that, to build on good ideas. The problem is that good idea got compromised, so that's complicated. So now let's talk about, that's 1776. Now let's talk about 1787, Philadelphia. There's an early proposal basically to prohibit the federal government from limiting importation of human beings. That would be slaves in any way, shape, or form. This is one of Mason's finest hours, and I want to read you what he says. It turns out, alas, it's more complicated. This infernal traffic originated in the avarice of British merchants, The British government constantly checked the attempts of Virginia to put a stop to it. Okay? The present question concerns not the importing slaves alone, but the whole Union. The evil of having slaves was experienced during the late war. Had slaves been treated as they might have by the enemy, they'd have proved dangerous instruments in their hands. But their folly dealt by the slaves as it did by the Tories. He mentioned the dangerous insurrections of the slaves in Greece and Sicily, and the instructions given by Cromwell to the commissioners sent to Virginia to arm the servants and slaves in case other means of obtaining submission should fail. Okay, so slavery actually weakens a society in war. It can be a mechanism for enemy subversion. Virginia and Maryland, he said, had already prohibited the importation of slaves expressly. North Carolina had done the same in substance. All this would be in vain if South Carolina and Georgia be at liberty to import. The Western people are already calling out for slaves for their new lands, and will fill that country with slaves if they can be got through South Carolina and Georgia. Slavery discourages arts and manufactures. The poor despise labor when performed by slaves. They prevent the immigration. Slavery prevents the immigration of whites who really enrich and strengthen a country. Slavery produces the most pernicious effect on manners. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. Slavery brings the judgment of heaven on a country. As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. Okay. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, providence punishes national sins by national calamities. If you listen to this carefully, there are precursors of Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address in all of this, okay? And that's really great, and that's how I first read it. It's more complicated, though, because here's what he doesn't say. He doesn't say slavery is actually evenless sin and a wrong to the enslaved. He says it's actually bad for masters. It means my kids are actually turning out to be bad human beings because they're lording, my George Mason's kids are, lording over others. It's bad for the whites. It's bad for the white society. It's not quite what you might want it to be if you just are trying to put him on a pedestal that's not complicated. So that's at Philadelphia. Then at the end, he, of course, opposes the Constitution at the end of the Philadelphia Convention, and he objects to it, and he publishes, or his objections are published early on. This would be September and October of 1787, and he begins by saying there's no Declaration of Rights, and that's heroic, and that's important, and where would we be without a Declaration of Rights? But it's complicated because if he had actually prevailed, there would be no United States of America. You see, there's a reason we're meeting actually in Washington, D.C., and not Mason, D.C. And the monument is not the Mason monument, it's the Washington monument. And the more sensible approach, we might think, is ratify the thing and then add a Bill of Rights, but that wasn't Mason's position. You see, because it's very easy to just oppose things. But history also remembers the people who actually get things done. Now, here's one, there are two final complications. One, what he does in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, since we talked about Madison. His objection is not to slavery itself. It's actually to the international slave trade, which will lower the price of slaves and actually, on protectionist grounds, be not so good from Virginia, which is producing a lot of slaves and wants to sell them, to other folks. He actually says 5 times, I won't give you all the quotes, in the Virginia Ratification Convention, that we're importing slaves, which are going to make us weaker, and the Constitution doesn't protect the slaves we have. He opposes the Constitution. I'll read you 1 or 2 of these, but there are 5, in all. He says it authorizes the importation of slaves for 20-odd years and thus continues upon that nefarious trade instead of securing and protecting us. The continuation of this, though this evil is increasing, there's no clause in the Constitution that will prevent the northern and eastern states from meddling with our whole property of that kind. So he says there ought to be a clause in the Constitution to secure us that property, which we've acquired under our former laws. So again and again, he says they're not prohibiting new slaves from coming in, but he also says, and they're not protecting the slaves we already have. So it's complicated. And then, yes, you're absolutely right. People are remembered by how they die. And he does die in 1792. But here's the thing. George Washington dies freeing his slaves, or at least doing the best that he can. And George Mason doesn't, and Thomas Jefferson doesn't, and James Madison doesn't. So it's complicated.
Well, how do you take his views on slavery with the fact that he actually owned slaves, and did he do anything to try to end the institution of slavery?
Well, it's further complicated. I know this is awkward, but academies have to be places where truths are told. So I'm the father of 3 children, and the truth is I'll do things for my kids that I won't do for myself. Welcome to parenthood. And George Washington doesn't have children of his own. He becomes father of his country because he's not father of his own children, and doesn't need to worry about providing for them, much less having 9, white children. So, and we heard earlier that he very much actually cares about his kids. He worries about slavery because he thinks it's making his kids bad human beings because they're lording over others, but it also is going to be much more difficult for him to actually free all the slaves, and you have to actually provide by law for any slave whom you free. You have to provide enough of a financial base so that he wouldn't become public charges. So now Madison, you see, has no children of his own, so he doesn't quite have that excuse, but he wants to provide for Dolly. Thomas Jefferson is a spendthrift, and he spends his whole life actually buying things that he can't afford, and so slave children are sold on auction blocks at his death. Families are ripped apart, and the only slaves he ends up freeing are the Hemmings family, which is connected to him by blood.
All right. Go ahead, if you'd like to respond.
What struck me about it is, everyone on this panel will know this much better than I do, but I've never found him to fret about it, right? Or to sort of deal with, you're right, that was the fiercest speech against slavery at the entire convention.
Apart from Gouverneur Morris and 4 others, but anyway.
Yeah, okay. But it was a great moment, right? On the other hand, he never, I don't know of any letters that he wrote, anything else he wrote, anything he said in public that reflected on sort of that contradiction, right? And not to be sort of incendiary or anything, maybe that's a good thing, because once you read the notes on Virginia, Jefferson's, you wish that he too had shut up.
Well, let's talk a little bit about just his general philosophy, with respect to the Bill of Rights as well as the Constitution. Can you mention anything about these original conversations that he might have? Professor Amar, obviously you're an originalist, and let's talk about a little bit about whether his philosophy dictated that. But then you also have the issue that he helped with the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights allows us to think about times and circumstances and changes and things. So is that a sense of his evolution of going toward living constitutionalism?
Obviously, one of his greatest contributions is this emphatic insistence on a Declaration of Rights. I think he may have carried it too far in the ratification process, insisting that if there's no Declaration of Rights, there can be no ratification. Here's why in the end that doesn't quite work. This is like the shutdown, okay? Because unless you ratify the Constitution, you're not going to get a Declaration of Rights, because you're going to need the articles will still be in place, and you'll need unanimity of all the states, and you're never going to get unanimity in this town or any other. So the only way in the end to get a Declaration of Rights is to ratify the Constitution, get 9 or 10 or 11 states on board. Once they're on board, the Constitution in Article 5 permits a different mechanism of an amendment mechanism that's not going to require unanimity. So that was the better way through. This is called the Massachusetts Plan. It's the fifth state to ratify. Ratify now, and then once the Constitution goes into effect, add a Bill of Rights, which is what Washington proposes in his first inaugural and what Madison gets done. Now, you might say, when Mason is calling for a Bill of Rights at the end of the Philadelphia Convention, the Massachusetts Plan hasn't kind of been proposed yet, and when he's opposing it in September and October publicly, not. So my bigger criticism is after the Massachusetts Plan, ratify now, add rights later, is put forward, and several of the states actually, they ratify with all sorts of proposed amendments. That's what Massachusetts does, it's what Maryland does, it's what a whole bunch of other states do. Mason, because he's a stubborn guy, you know, and it's hard to back down, and he doesn't back down at Virginia and kind of pivot, and he doubles down. And unfortunately, he doubles down in an awkward way because one of his biggest criticisms isn't just there's no Declaration of Rights. He says there's not enough protection for our existing slaves. One final point, because you won't get this if you just read on a cold transcript. It's like an appellate judge. You know, what really happened at trial? You can read the transcript, but you weren't there. You know, you can't hear. So he's proposing at the very end a Declaration of Rights. And he says, look, listen, it won't take forever. And
It'll take an afternoon.
that's what he says. Okay, and and he actually he is the father of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, so he kind of knows what he's talking about. And I can actually see the eye rolls of the other people, because here's actually what they're thinking, truthfully. This guy says it's an afternoon, but he's a pain in the butt. That's a technical legal term. And it's going to be at least a week, maybe two. The convention has lasted much longer than we thought. We want to go back home to our wives, to our farms, to our children, to our mistresses, to our pets. You know, we want to go home. We're tired, okay? And they made this was a huge mistake that they made, not listening to him, because there were two big objections to the Constitution that almost doomed it. No Bill of Rights, and Congress is too small. He was prophetic, but he was also a little too stubborn.
You know, that's exactly right. He's very stubborn, irascible, strong-willed. By the way, the mistresses were in Philadelphia.
Not all of them.
That's part of the historical
okay.
record.
Not all of
No,
them.
Everything else, you're right, they're heading back home. But anyway, we're not going to spend too much time on that. Here's what hasn't yet been stated, and I think this is one of the most important aspects of his legacy. He was very strongly against a strong executive. He wanted any number of different changes that were not adopted. And there's a couple of reasons why they weren't adopted. One of which was Mason shows up very concerned about executive power. He didn't want another king. Hamilton would have been perfectly happy with another king. Madison shows up not trusting legislatures. So right from the start, you have a conflict there. Madison, he wants to do something about out-of-control legislatures. Hamilton, he's perfectly happy with monarchical powers. Washington is up there on the podium, never says a word, but everyone presumes he is going to be the first president. Yes. There had been a falling out between Washington and Mason after 1770, when Washington came back from the war. Mason, as I said, was contemplative. He was actually the senior partner of that friendship. He was older, he was wealthier, he was more established. His farm was more profitable. Washington comes back as the American Cincinnatus. And there was some conflict there. And Mason spends all summer long saying, we can't have a powerful president. Not because of George Washington, but because of what might happen in the future. Let's say, for example, in the 21st century,
Mm-hmm.
Pause.
Mm-hmm.
How about the 20th?
A little
Or the 19th.
There we
Well-
go. There we go. And so here's what's really interesting. All summer long, Mason is talking about Article 2 and how it has to be changed.
Yes.
All summer long, he's losing. And he's irascible, he's stubborn, he's tired. And towards the end, and we have friends from the Society of the Cincinnati here. Towards the end, that relationship between Washington and Mason, which is now in tatters, Mason decides he's going to throw a little gasoline on it and light it. Here we go. Washington was a man very reserved, held everything close to the vest. No children, as you pointed out. He loved his wife. He loved his farm. I don't know, you could say if he loved his officers. He was certainly fiercely devoted to his officers, who then became the Society of the Cincinnati. So what does Mason do as we're getting into September? He speaks out strongly against popular elections for president. And he wins on that part. We have the Electoral College. But he speaks out strongly and he says, a popular election in any form would throw the appointment into the hands of the Cincinnati, a society for the members of which I have great respect, but never wish to have a preponderating influence in the government. Well, George, take that. Standing right in front of George Washington, who is got to be seething. And so he leaves Philadelphia, losing when it comes to Article 2, losing when it comes to that afternoon that was not spent writing the Bill of Rights, and just ready to do battle in the ratifying convention.
Your Honor, that's brilliant. I think it's a nice contrast if we pick one other person we haven't talked about that much yet, who also was very skeptical of a strong executive, came from a state that really didn't even have an executive. Justice Weck's home state of Pennsylvania just had a kind of council, a committee under that Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776. I'm talking, of course, about Dr. Franklin. Mm-hmm. And he didn't like the strong executive, but he had a different personality than and he's the other incomparably great person at Philadelphia. There's Washington and Franklin, and the rest of them are pygmies compared to these two. To Dr.
Mason
Franklin
was a little bit more than a pygmy. Come on.
No one outside of Virginia knows that. Okay, and
That's why we're here.
I know, but you're a Virginian, Your Honor, and the Yankees don't know that at all. They know Washington and Franklin is world famous, and so is Washington. He's the most famous man in the world because he's given up his army, and Franklin is the man who brings American Prometheus, who brings fire from the sky. But Franklin has a different personality, and at the very end has a very different kind of performance. It's just like, this document, it's not quite what I would have loved, but it's the product of compromise and accommodation, and I'm not sure I'm right. It's possible that the collective wisdom is greater than mine, and that's a different kind of personality. Because listen, George Mason is fine, but he's no Ben Franklin. Really, let's be honest, he's not. Okay, Ben Franklin is a genius of a sort that comes as like a Da Vinci-like genius. But with this extraordinary democratic humility, Franklin has lost on unitary executive and a whole bunch of other things, but is saying, listen, we gotta actually work together and then we can fix it, once we move forward. And there was astonishing, I think, humility and wisdom in that.
Yes, but I was going to say and I'm not an expert on the Constitution. I will be soon, but I'm not. I'm working on it.
I think you're next.
But no, I mean, Madison was bitterly opposed to a Bill of Rights. Hamilton was quite opposed to having that as part of the Constitution because the structural argument was that the federal government wouldn't have enough power to override the kinds of rights like trial by jury and treason and that sort of thing, if they didn't have the power, well, they did have treason, but they didn't have these other powers, religion or speech or certain of the criminal authorities, so that, you know, it would be superfluous. And you know, Mason was intimate with Madison. He had great respect for him, and they were also at odds. So, and this played out in the Virginia ratifying convention as well.
Can I just, I agree with much of that. But I think some of the arguments my friend Alexander Hamilton comes up with, you know, we don't need a Bill of Rights. Come on, Alex. I mean, that was obviously, you know, not serious. I think most of it, as Akhil suggested, was about the timing. It wasn't really a big deal, right? I mean, once the Constitution had been ratified, it wasn't such a big deal anymore either. Whereas if you sort of allow, I mean, the vote has to be, I mean, there's something Mason said at the very end of the convention. This is no way to pass a constitution. Take it or leave it. And, right, without amendments, I mean, you take the entire constitution or you vote no. And he thought we should have a public debate and, you know, discuss possible amendments. And as you said earlier, Akhil, that's a prescription for disaster. The whole thing will, you know, fall apart. And I mean, that's how George Washington took the objections which Mason had sent to him. There's another point to this, and it's this, to my mind. I mean, when we sort of talk about a Bill of Rights now, right, we think it's all that Crim-Pro stuff, Amendment 4 to 8, right? But what they meant, what they had in mind is a Declaration of Right. And that is a very different matter. It has to do with sort of, we ought to, you know, practice Christian virtue. And there are pronouncements about the separation of powers, Lots of different people have lots of different ideas about that. It's not that easy to fit that into the Constitution, to sort of quote a very famous academic, just as you want to read the Constitution as a Bill of Rights, you want to read the Bill of Rights as a Constitution. And in the debates, you have to make sure that whichever way you write the Bill of Rights will fit structurally with the pre-existing structure of the Constitution. That's impossible to do in a public forum. You really need a Congress that is paying attention. You need somebody who controls the agenda there, or at least sort of channels it into the right direction.
Here's one riff on that. The others that we've been talking about are more adept politicos. They don't just live in Gunston Hall. He's the most isolationist of them. He doesn't venture out so much. And they're more clever at pivoting and compromising. So Franklin, basically says, take a little from here and a little there and put it together. Madison, who opposes a Bill of Rights, in the end authors it. Washington actually endorses it in his inaugural address. Hamilton will actually, he in the Federalist 77, he says, oh, presidents can't fire cabinet officers or department heads at will without getting the Senate's approval. That's Federalist number 77. I know there was something today about that somehow. But then he pivots. He wants to become Secretary of the Treasury. So some of these other folks have a certain flexibility. And we talked about, he's a little bit more stubborn. He's a little bit more introverted. He wasn't able to pivot as easily in saying, I oppose this because there isn't a Declaration of Rights. But now that we're here in Virginia and a whole bunch of states have ratified and endorsed amendments, maybe that's what we can do.
Well, I will just say I have been in en banc arguments where people make their last-ditch appeals, right? I mean, that's what you do when you try to extend the time or say, well, we'll let it work out in the writing and so on. So I don't regard any of that as, that's just normal tactics of getting along in a difficult situation like that. He was a member of the House of Burgesses several times. He was a small kind of judge in Fairfax County. He was no stranger to public life. Now, he may not have been a temporizer or a politician willing to make compromises, but
never outside of Virginia, really. I think,
Pardon me?
Isn't it the case that he doesn't leave his home state except to go to Philadelphia?
That's right. He actually had property in Maryland. He crossed the Potomac.
he had property that became Georgetown.
Yeah. The only time he made a long journey was to Philadelphia, and during
Which isn't that long.
Yeah, well, it was then. And during one recess, he goes up to New York City. He doesn't like it, and he comes back. And another reason why I feel so strongly about his greatness. Now, I do want to point out there's one aspect that we haven't yet mentioned. I want to go back to 1775. So we've all, I hope, been watching the Ken Burns American Revolution. 1775 ends. Things are not really going all that well. Second Continental Congress is going to be meeting throughout 1776. Washington leaves Boston for Brooklyn. Things don't go too well there in 1776. There's one person, I don't usually say nice things about John Adams, but there's one person who's thinking about the long game. In late 1775, John Adams starts to draft what would eventually become the essay Thoughts on Government, that we don't really learn that much about nowadays. But Thoughts on Government is where he set forth a structure. He left Locke and went to Montesquieu. He sets forth a structure, and the Second Continental Congress passes a resolution encouraging every state to adopt a state constitution, a written, formalized state constitution. That was not part of the English experience. They don't have a comprehensive constitution.
Now they have no constitution.
No, don't tell them that. No,
So,
no writ.
But so what happens is this. Early drafts come out in 1775. George Wythe gets a draft. Richard Henry Lee gets a draft. They pass it on to Mason. So Mason is thinking in terms of Virginia needs a constitution. And Virginia, and frankly, New Hampshire and South Carolina beat Virginia to it, but if there's any South Carolinians out there, you all are fine people, and New Hampshireites, you all are fine people. Yeah, oh yes, I know that, yes. My father was from Timminsville, okay? All right, go Gamecocks. But it was Mason's Constitution that passed on June 29th, 1776. Virginia actually was the first to have a comprehensive constitution. And that's actually the glue, those 12 constitutions, one state didn't adopt one. Those 12 constitutions were the glue that started to hold everything together through as the war heated up. And so when you look at, it wasn't a perfect constitution. In fact, Mason, as you might guess, did not have a powerful governor. How about that? The legislature was the most powerful. But it was a constitution that actually followed the outline that Adams had put out in Thoughts of Government. And then that became the model for so many other states afterwards. So he never wanted, there's not a whole lot of credit for that. But that is where the Virginia Declaration of Rights fits. The Virginia Declaration of Rights was Article 1 of the Virginia Constitution of 1776. To this day, it is still Article 1 of the Virginia Constitution. Back in the 1990s, I proposed an amendment to the Virginia Constitution for a crime victims' Bill of Rights that's now part of many state constitutions. I'm defending it on the floor of the state Senate, and one of my colleagues got up and said, "What would George Mason say about this?" Because I was adding to his Declaration of Rights. I said, I chatted with him. Surely he would approve it.
Well, we've talked about individual rights and as distinct from Declaration of Rights. And then also, we haven't really had a chance to talk about other constitutional infirmities that he might have thought about with respect to state and federalism. Do you all have any views on that with respect to what he thought?
Well, he was plainly a Virginian, as well as he was one of the original, a significant advocate, as Michael said, of abandoning the Confederation. He knew there had to be centralized government, but he also believed the states had to be more powerful. And I think he had a very coherent view of the relationship between the federal and the state governments, whether you accept them or not, whether they were politically the most astute relationship or not is something. But he insisted on the government being as close to the people as possible. And therefore, one point in the Virginia Constitution was the origination clause. He was still thinking about no taxation without representation. And therefore, every bill raising money had to go before the representatives. And if he had had his way, I believe this was true in the original Virginia Constitution, the state Senate was not allowed to do anything except vote up or down on the monetary bills. He wanted that to be in the federal Constitution, but the origination clause went in, the approval. The Senate, however, was able to approve things. He was very concerned about commercial regulation and navigation laws. And he thought that there should be a supermajority in Congress before any such laws should be passed. One thing he was thinking about was when Britain passed the Navigation Acts favoring English shipping over American shippers and depriving the export colonies, the South, of the ability to choose the lowest price for cargo carriage. But this came back. Madison realized that things were going wrong when the proposal came up for a national bank, for instance. And apparently, I believe that was while Mason was still alive, that they were talking about debating a national bank. And Madison was a little more warm toward the fact that Mason had objections to the Constitution. I want to point out one other thing, that his objections to the Constitution are about 15 or 16, and one of them goes directly against the necessary and proper clause. And and it seems to me one of the most prescient, under their own construction of the general clause at the end of the enumerated powers, Congress may grant monopolies in trade and commerce, constitute new crimes, inflict unusual and severe punishments, and extend their powers as far as they shall think proper, so that the state legislatures have no security for the powers now presumed to remain to them or the people for their rights.
Regarding any of his objections to the Constitution, has history vindicated his concerns?
You asked that on the day that the Slaughter case was argued in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. Yeah, well, I mean, he was very concerned about the imperial presidency, and one could say he was so strongly against the unitary executive that he didn't want a unitary executive. He wanted three, and so. I think that there's many times that history has vindicated his concerns. You mentioned Article 1, Section 8, McCulloch v. Maryland. I tell my students that's when the necessary and proper clause became the necessary and the convenient and proper clause, because that's what opened up interstate commerce, the definition of interstate commerce, to any number of different things. he would have been appalled by that decision.
Other vindications?
Well, hang on.
Uh-oh.
Three,
If I get to a
three executives, because that worked out so well for Rome. And that's worked out so well in every one of the 50 states that they all have three
I didn't
executives.
say that I endorsed it.
No, I thought we were talking about history as vindicated. No, these are crackpot ideas we now think, because it didn't work for Rome, it doesn't work for any of the states. Only one state, my friend Justice Wex over there, didn't have a single person heading up the executive branch.
I wasn't endorsing
Oh.
that part. I was
Oh,
saying
okay. I
that
thought she was saying West history
no,
vindicated him.
His opposition to the strong executive.
Okay.
The imperial executive.
So, but here's why he has this opposition, and here's why Washington and Franklin see it differently. See, because some of them were getting their butts shot off, and they're and freezing to death at Valley Forge, and others of them weren't. And if you were with John Marshall and Alexander Hamilton, and above all, George Washington, you understand the national security imperatives that drive, much of the Constitution. And if you weren't there, if you're Thomas Jefferson chasing women and doing other things to women in Paris at this time, and not, you see, at Valley Forge, or James Madison, or you're at Gunston Hall, you have a different revolutionary experience than Washington, Hamilton, and Marshall above all.
And the interesting thing is, during the Revolution, with 9 children, Mason did not permit his sons to serve in the Continental Army. They served in the Virginia militia. And he spent his time supporting, in many ways, the Virginia militia rather than the Continental Army, which is another one of those fracture points with George Washington. Now, he would never be accused of being a nationalist.
And speaking
in any
of
way.
freezing, since we also mentioned Franklin is Join or Die. It's the world's first political cartoon. It's 1754. He continues to have that strong unionist vision throughout the beginning of the Revolution, before independence has even been declared, because he's the only one who speaks French. He actually goes up into Quebec to try to persuade these Canadians to join our cause, and is freezing to death. There are the Unionists who actually win, the Continentalists who are winning the war, and they understand that a bank is pretty darn useful to win wars, and the people who actually aren't at the fighting end don't understand that to the same extent, so they have different views about the first bank and other things.
Can I just, yeah, sorry.
By the way, I was just going to say that over the past several years, one of the highlights for me was the day that I picked up Professor Amar at the Richmond airport and spent all day long driving him around and peppering him with questions. So if the two of us ever disagree, be nice to me, but take notes from him.
Can I,
Your comment,
just,
and then we'll go to questions.
look, here's something that always struck me about the way Mason thought. So he was very distrustful, mostly of a strong presidency, right? But of the national or central government in general. He didn't much like the Senate either, because it wasn't representative, right? And he thought the House was way too small to be representative in any way, right? And so in that way, he was very, very distrustful. This is what drove Madison to despair in Richmond at the ratifying convention. I mean, George Mason made up one horror scenario after another, right? Oh, they're going to give away the Mississippi. They're going to do this and they're going to do that. And Madison finally barked at him and just, look, you assume that they're going to do perpetrate every perfidy you can think of, and never exercise their powers to do the good that they're supposed to be doing. At some point, you have to trust somebody. Okay, and this is it's a particularly instructive point. I think Madison was right about that, and I think it's a particularly important point in this regard. George Mason hated state politics too, right? He did serve in 2 legislatures, right? But he had a constant, running battle with judges and officials in Fairfax and Alexandria. He thought they were all corrupt and stupid. He thought the same thing about the politicians in Richmond. And so he didn't like that. In that way, he's very, very different from sometimes in anti-federalist writings. You find a lot of romanticism about small states. There's another thing that hasn't worked very well over history, but let that go, right? And in sort of a lot of modern day sort of policy writing about American politics, deep thought. Ooh, Tocqueville. Ooh, town meetings, civic engagement, that'll save the country. No, he didn't think about that either. He didn't think about those kinds of politics either. Now, to my mind, the premise of distrust is a very, very good public attitude vis-a-vis government under a Republican form of government, unless you take it to extremes and tell yourself a story, which is the story of America is the unfailingly virtuous American citizenry, which is perennially betrayed by its corrupt politicians and its rotten institutions, right? And that is not a good attitude to have, to my mind, because everything becomes dystopian, right? There is the original Constitution, and then everything else is entropy and decay. And that's not a good, I wouldn't put that at George Mason's feet, because he made too many sort of positive contributions to the Constitution, to the public debate at his time, right? I mean, the way this worked was Publius, the Federalist. That's a response to the anti-Federalist, not the other way around. They had to respond, and so in that way, George Washington thought, and he wouldn't lie, Mason et al. Made even the Federalist better. But there is that sort of streak of don't trust any institution, right? Assume the worst of them. And to that extent, to the extent that there's a whiff of that in Mason, I'm a little nervous.
I really don't think he was that kind of overall cynic or whatever. I do think he had very high hopes for government, but it had to be severely controlled. He wrote the letter to the London merchants in connection with the Stamp Act. He also, which was a very powerful defense of the rights of Englishmen and how the crown was imposing on the Englishmen, among other things, part of the Stamp Act as early as that, 1754, was when they were doing away with jury trial rights in some instances and shipping complainants back to England for trial by jury. This was fundamental breach. He was well aware of the English Bill of Rights and what the important things were that Englishmen had fought for, that they had no taxation without representation in Parliament, although he considered a lot of the English form of government to be corrupt. I think he had a very healthy attitude about the potential for government to corrupt one's motives and one's means, and therefore was an advocate of subsidiarity and individual liberty.
All right, we'll take a couple of questions. You all can go to the various microphones. Don't be shy.
It's great, because I have 2 questions.
can hear you.
My first is what we know, if anything, about the intellectual influences on George Mason. I think with some of the other founders we're very familiar with, who they read, what they studied, what history they were familiar with. Do we know that about Mason at all? And my second question is simply whether, even though he didn't get the Bill of Rights when he wanted it, was he nonetheless a really important influence in the
I think the answer to the second question is definitely yes, and we should very much remember that at the very top of the things to remember on a day such as this day, a week such as this day, commemorating the 300th anniversary of his birth. On the first question, yes, he had an amazing library, and we have some sense of the many books that he read. He was a very bookish sort. It's connected to being introvert. I do recommend to all of you, if you haven't been to the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, I do recommend a visit, and you can also experience it online. And they have, at the National Constitution Center, a whole segment devoted to the framers' libraries, what they actually read. It's a brainchild of Jeff Rosen, who's a wonderful just a national treasure, and the National Constitution Center is a great place. So if you're interested in what Mason's library and the libraries of the other founders, check out the National Constitution Center's Founders Library.
George Mason has a online information about George Mason University, about George Mason, the founder, although this discussion goes beyond that. But they reprint the Virginia Declaration of Rights along with a paragraph by paragraph which ones were adopted in the US Constitution. And the answer is of about 16, about 9 of them were adopted in the US Constitution. What he read included Locke, Montesquieu. He alluded to Cicero. He had studied, he was proficient in Latin, evidently, and may have studied some Greek. He had Scottish tutors for a little while, but he had read Lord Coke because his uncle had a formidable legal library. Algernon Sidney, he was familiar with the Whigs, arguments, and there were other discourses that were going around. I mean, the whole idea of natural rights was really, that was one of the questions we had, was very common at the time when England decided that it was going to pay for its wars on the backs of the colonists.
So very little, really no formal education. It was all tutors. But exactly as Judge Jones just mentioned, Locke, Montesquieu, the English Republicans, Algernon Sidney, the Scottish Enlightenment, he was familiar with all of it. He really was the great intellect among the Virginians. And his influence on Madison is not documented, but I would say there's a lot of evidence of it, and here's why. Madison goes to the College of New Jersey, comes under the tutelage of John Witherspoon. So he gets Locke, he gets Montesquieu, he gets all of those influences. He comes back and goes to his farm in Orange, Montpelier. And at age 25, he has his first statewide posting. He comes to the convention that will adopt the Declaration of Rights and the Virginia Constitution. Mason is 51 years old, recognized as the author of those. Madison is 25, and he's there for the first time, and their intellectual pedigree is very, very similar. And we know actually that Madison offered a very important amendment.
Huge.
Mason would have tolerated other religions, Madison took out the word tolerated and made it so that other religions were on the same plane, same footing. But what must it have been like to be 25 years old and sitting there at the knee of the master at the time, who is preparing a document that is immortal? When you read, and by the way, you've got it right here. Read the Virginia Declaration of Rights. The First, Second, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, Eighth, and Ninth Amendments all are in there to some extent. The only one that's the 10th Amendment is missing because we didn't have federalism yet. The Third Amendment is missing because it wasn't written by Massachusetts patriots who already had soldiers in their homes. So the only thing that's missing is federalism in the quartering prohibition. It's remarkable how in 1776, Mason already gets it.
Hi. Thank you. I'm John Burlaw, Director of Finance Policy and Senior Fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and also the author of George Washington Entrepreneur, about George Washington's many entrepreneurial ventures, from mule breeding to the whiskey distillery. And George Mason, that since Gunston Hall was so close to Mount Vernon, figures a lot in there as there talks about business and some of the British taxes and edicts on what they couldn't manufacture, other things. And my question is about the Fairfax Resolves, which Ms. Payne mentioned at the beginning. And also, I apologize if I stepped out for a few minutes. It was mentioned here, but it wasn't quite, it was in 1774, a Declaration of Independence yet, but it was, they weren't calling for independence, but it was that, and this is what George Mason had written with George Washington and signed by, I think, like a couple dozen other Fairfax County property owners. It did have a list of grievances like the Declaration of Independence, and it also called, foreshadowing or maybe influencing Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration, called for an end of the slave trade and called slavery a wicked, cruel, and unnatural trade. And I just wondered if any of you could weigh in on whether and how much this could have influenced on the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the Declaration of Independence that would come a couple of years, U.S. Declaration of Independence that could come a couple of years later.
I'm no expert on the Fairfax resolutions, but I want you always going forward, all the people in the audience, to pay attention in Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence, in Mason's comments. Are they talking about slavery? Are they talking about the slave trade? Those are not the same thing. Pay attention to that distinction everywhere.
Well, I mean, Mason's views about government had been formed pretty early in his life, I believe. And again, that's why I referenced his letter to the London merchants in connection with the Stamp Act, which was 10 years before the Fairfax Resolves. And a lot of the Fairfax Resolves, which I reviewed quickly within the last day or two, but I can't recite it, they are more full, they replicate a lot of the complaints about the overreach of the monarchy and the Parliament against the colonies. So they replicate those. They talk about the importance of the rights of Englishmen, of the necessity for trial by a jury, of a jury in the vicinage as opposed to being transported. Anyway, a lot of those concerns actually show up in better written form in the Declaration of Independence.
The resolves, there was both. We got to give credit to all of Northern Virginia. He also drafted the Prince William resolves. Okay, so but the resolves were being drafted and approved throughout the northern colonies in 1774 and early 1775. The significance, you can see his thought process going from 1774 right on through for the next 15 years or more. The significance was this: up until then, they had been protesting these various British policies. But the Fairfax Resolves, one historian said, it was now treason. This is where they started to cross the Rubicon, and which would end with the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, he had.
That's their significance.
Yeah, they point out at the very end of it and he had believed this for quite a while, that if government abuses fundamental rights, the people have a right to change the government.
Well, thank you to our esteemed panel that needed very little moderation.
Well, once again, thank you to Judge Childs. Thank you to our excellent panelists and for the insight that they provided here tonight. And most importantly, thank you to all of you for engaging in this conversation with all of us and for visiting us here at Scalia Law School and the Law and Economics Center. I hope that we will see you back here at another time. And I wish you all the happiest of holidays as you go forth, and see you soon. Thanks.